Hey everybody, welcome to my new um, nighttime bunker recording studio. This is where I do some work here when everybody else is asleep. I'm at my in-laws' house. This is their dark and cold basement, and there's a couple of cat-shaped shadows lurking around. If you see something weird in the background, it's probably that, I hope. Anyway, um, I got a question for you to get into this video. What does The Merchant of Venice and Othello have in common? Give up. It's Venice, people. These are the two plays that Shakespeare set in Venice. I think there's only those two plays that Shakespeare set in Venice. That's probably something I should have looked up before I started recording this video. Whatever. I think those are the only two. They're two interesting, it's kind of similar plays, despite being comedy and tragedy, in that they each have a different take on one of Europe's sort of more prominent, that is to say, Christian Europe, sort of more prominent others. The Merchant of Venice, featuring um, the one of the probably the single most famous representation of Jewish man in the Renaissance by a European writer, that is Shylock, the moneylender, and Othello, being centered on a multiracial marriage between a Venetian noblewoman and uh, an African military commander attached to the Venetian fleet. So I wanted to talk about Venice. It's in the title. I want to talk about Venice, and in that I want to sort of sidestep what is usually the first order of business with the Merchant of Venice, which is the representation of a Jew. Um, but I think this play, I think Venice is a very important factor in this play. Maybe it's a sort of enabling factor for even being able to represent, um, however problematically and complicated it is, how it's be able to represent a Jewish man in this way um, on the English stage. Um, so, Venice is an important factor in this play in a way I think that other plays set in this sort of fantasy Italy are, don't have their setting as a very important factor. That is to say, I don't think Romeo and Juliet would suffer much if it wasn't Verona that it was set in. I don't think Taming of the Shrew would suffer at all if it wasn't Padua. But there's something about Venice that matters in The Merchant of Venice that I wanted to talk about a little bit. Um, so just to sort of, how fast can I do this? Just to get into what Renaissance Venice was, or I should specify, 16th century Venice was. Well, one thing Venice was power, powerful. It was an island nation as it is today, sort of floating on bogs off the coast of the northern Italy, northeastern Italy, although it wasn't Italy at the time. That is to say that the nation, the modern country of Italy, didn't exist for hundreds of years. Italy was rather a, oops, wrong direction. Sorry, this map sucks, by the way. It's just the biggest map I could get for free. Anyway, Italy was a region in which there were many different, completely politically separate entities, larger than the city-states famous of like 13th, 14th century Italy, but still very separate, even with their own different dialects. Not, excuse me, I should say, just to be correct, languages. Um, we say dialects of Italy today to sort of underplay the differences. But these different places spoke different languages in the sense that they derived from Latin in the same way, let's say Venetian and Florentine derived from Latin in the same way that French and Spanish derived from Latin. So they're all of them being French, Spanish, Italian, excuse me, French, Spanish, Florentine, and Venetian, etc., being dialects of Latin rather than dialects of Italian. That's a point that doesn't really matter here. I just wanted to point it out. These were very different places with political animosities that often ran very deep. Venice was surely the most powerful of them all. In fact, it was one of the most powerful states in the world at the time, owing to its vast maritime holdings. So, it was a sort of floating city, and appropriately, therefore, it was a floating power. It had a sort of international range of trading and shipping and mercantile interests, and it had actual maybe imperial holdings all of these kind of nasty teal-colored places, including a good chunk of what we know as Greece and Crete and Cyprus, and even this little pinch right here, and over here on the north coast of the Black Sea. Venice was everywhere. Um, and Venice's being everywhere, by the way, was instrumental in the conveyance of the Black Plague to the West, but whatever. So, being everywhere in the Western Mediterranean, Venice was sure to come into contact with the other great power that was everywhere in the Mediterranean. That is, wait for another crappy map, the Ottoman Empire, which in the 16th century was one of the most powerful players in the entire region of the world. This map isn't exactly from contemporary with the other map, as you can see. According to this map, the Peloponnese is now in Ottoman hands. So, by the way, these maps aren't the most authoritative things. Again, it's just what I could get for free. Anywho, you could kind of see, if you could remember that last map, that Venice is sort of vying for the same territory that the Turkish Empire, the Ottoman Empire, was vying for. So, naturally, and after a couple hundred years of sort of mutual piracy and the Ottomans' fleets basically running roughshod, whatever, over all of these sort of coastal Christian territories. Now, I'm using Christian here for a reason you'll get to in a minute, but just kind of running wild and without any consequences, raiding and looting in the coastal areas, the coastal cities of the Christian West. Anyway, with Venice and Istanbul basically trying to cover some of the same territory and control it in their mercantile interests, they were bound to come in conflict, and they sure did. In particular, in a battle, it's probably the most famous in its day and the most forgotten now, a battle that took place right in here on the sea on October 7th, 1571. It's usually called the Battle of Lepanto. It was just the biggest sea battle that probably had ever taken place. Although I can't speak entirely with authority in Southeast Asia or Chinese waters, but it was extremely large. Hundreds, maybe 200 to 200, 300 large warships on either side came to clash here when a united Christian fleet, usually it's called the Holy League, which was basically made up of Spain, and Spain at just the height of its power under Philip II. This is the Spain that created the Armada, which, but for the grace of God, would have probably overrun England. Spain, a sort of papal state conglomerate of Genoa and a couple of other local areas that are sort of loyal to the Pope, Pius V, and Venice. Venice supplying over 50% of the fleet, 109 galleys, and these 6 gigantic galleasses, which were converted, very large merchant ships, converted to for war, with just a whole row of cannons, something like 52 oars on either side. This met a massive fleet, almost the same size, of the Ottoman Turks, commanded by this guy named Ali Pasha. Anyway, the battle was just crazy. If we can believe even the conservative estimates of contemporary reports, and by the way, we really can't, because they were prone to exaggerate. Hell, history, almost all history is prone to exaggerate anyway. But sources seem to suggest that something like 7,000 Christian sailors and warriors on these ships died in this battle, and something like 30,000 maybe died on the Ottoman side. That's like 37,000 in a good morning and a half of fighting, like a one full light day of fighting. It was sick, because like the Battle of Gettysburg had only like 7,000 dead. The Battle of the Somme, which is kind of famously the most deadly battle of all time in World War I think 19,000 are said to have died. But in this naval battle, if the figures are to be sort of trusted at all, and like I said, maybe they can't, something like 37,000 people died. The sea was, in poems and reports, the sea was red with blood. So it was like the largest naval battle in Mediterranean history, and kind of the last big battle in Mediterranean history. Oddly, after this battle, like not much happened. The Ottomans had another fleet ready to go and harry the West almost immediately. The Holy League kind of flittered about and Spain just kind of decided to ignore the Mediterranean more or less because it was busy cultivating its New World empire and trying to take over England and stuff. Um, but Venice still emerged very powerful from this battle. But another thing that this battle was very immediately famous. Like epic poems were written about this battle in like weeks. All of Europe knew of this battle. By the way, the Christian fleet won. So it was this big moment. Yay, the Christians beat the Ottomans. Um, at any rate, though, it became sort of part of Venice's sort of foundational story. Venice was a world power, a winner, an international might. It could even break the Ottoman Empire. None of that's really true, but it's all built into what Venice means to an audience in 1590 going to see a play called The Merchant of Venice. Venice was rich, it was powerful, it was everywhere. Um, but it was also a multicultural empire. Um, One interesting thing about this battle, among all of the other interesting things about it, was that on each side were just oodles, maybe thousands of members of the other side in the form of galley slaves. So, how do you get a bunch of people to just pull oars on these ships? Um, well, you arrest them, you capture them in war. Another popular way of getting yourself landed in one of these ships as an oarsman was to be in debt. Which brings us to the other word in the title of this play, The Merchant of Venice. And what's at stake in going into debt, losing everything? So there was a multicultural, multi-ethnic body of people on these boats and a multicultural, multi-ethnic body of people on these. Even the crack troops of the Ottoman Empire, the Janissaries, which were like these incredibly trained sharpshooters, stormtroopers, feared everywhere, were culled from the western reaches of the Ottoman Empire. That is to say, the Balkans, Serbia and Greece and Croatia and Albania. In other words, Europeans were taken from their homes at a young age and trained to be these sharpshooting stormtroopers, the Janissaries, feared everywhere, right? So they were on the Turkish side. In a way, it was everybody fighting everybody on all sides, ethnically speaking. So Venice, in other words, is kind of for an English audience and an English author, ideal, maybe kind of the perfect place to stage encounters of others, like black-skinned African people, of whom, by the way, we have a representative even in The Merchant of Venice in the form of this Prince of Morocco who comes to do the contest for Portia, which we'll talk about in a second. It's an ideal place to have of an encounter with a Jewish moneylender, despite the fact that Jews were sort of this unfortunately oppressed people all over Europe and the Ottoman Empire, though far more powerful and able to live normal lives in the Ottoman Empire, actually. But Venice was sort of the Western representative of a door to everything. It was a great place to have such a sort of international scope as the Merchant of Venice. And of course, it's just the ideal place to talk about value and the problem of equating moral value and financial value, which I think is at the heart of this play, and it's something that comes up pretty quick at the beginning of this play. What I wanted to do with the rest of this video is kind of just look at some things that I notice in these opening scenes. This opening act is just great because it's sort of, it brings up in its three scenes kind of the three areas, three theaters or conceptual sort of centers of this play, which will become entangled and forced to sort of encounter each other as the play goes on. That is to say, the sort of domain of Antonio and the merchants, his friends Salerio or Salarino and Solanio here that he talks to at the beginning of this play. Their names basically mean money and cashman or cashman and yeah, I don't know, Tango and Cash, whatever. These two yucksters. Anyway, so the merchants kind of are sort of the first scene, and their world is sort of one of the worlds that is overlapped. What's the next one? Somewhere else, but still under the rubric of Venice, but definitely, but importantly, not in Venice. We need to get to this place, Belmonte or Belmont, where Portia is a noblewoman whose father has set for her, who set the conditions of her courtship as a game to choose between three kinds of value. Chests, you have to pick a chest. One of them gets you Portia, and the other two means you have, if you choose the other two, you have to renounce marriage forever and leave. So that's something, that's sort of another major concern, another major domain. And then finally, the domain of Shylock, Shylock the moneylender. So famous mistake, a popular mistake of this play is to think that the Merchant of Venice refers to Shylock. Of course not. He's not a merchant. He can't be a merchant, at least not under sort of the imprimatur of Venice. Jews were in these centuries from the medieval on. In Christian Europe, they were not allowed to join the craft guilds, the trade guilds. They were not allowed to have a craft or trade. So what do they do to support themselves? Well, money lending was one of the only ways. But of course, they're sort of roundly, therefore, Jews are sort of just casually associated with money and money lending because they could do nothing else to make money. And then disparaged for it as if they had much of a choice. So Shylock represents all of these things. He's got kind of a third domain. So what are the sort of takeaway points of these three domains? Well, let's just zoom in for a minute here and take a look at these opening acts. By the way, the language in this play, I think, gets a little more complex, and yet I find it to be a little more logically kind of necessary for the play. I'll try to find ways of substantiating that, but sometimes it's pretty hard to keep the sense and flow of the language because well, one, we're 400 years away from the register in which this language really made sense, its native context. But also Shakespeare is really putting on the Ritz here. He's kind of making glossy and glistening and valuable in one way just the words. And I think that's a part of the intentional fabric of the Merchant of Venice. So anyway, Antonio is the Merchant of Venice. He's the first guy that talks. But as a comedy, he's a very interesting first character to see and a very interesting hero of a comedy because he's not the romantic lead, right? He comes in and he says, "In sooth, I know not why I'm so sad." All right, we got a sad guy on the stage. We know this is a comedy because they usually tell you before you get into the Globe or wherever you're watching this. So what is he sad about? Your guess is probably going to be love. That's what comedies are about. But that's not what Antonio's problem is, and I love how we find that out. He's got these two guys whose names mean something like Moneybags and Cashman, and they're like, "What are you so sad about?" He says, "Oh, by the way," he says, "what stuff 'tis made of, I'm so sad, it wearies me." You say it wearies you, but how I caught it, found it, or came by it, what stuff 'tis made of, whereof it is born, I am to learn, that is, I don't know yet, and such a want wit sadness makes of me, that is, sadness makes such a witless person of me that I have much ado to know myself. He's in a real philosophical quandary. Why? Now, I'll ask you this, guys, as you keep reading this play. Do we ever find out? Does it ever matter why this guy is sad? Why are we starting with this guy's sadness? Anyway, everybody wants to know. The concern of scene one is, why is Antonio so down? Well, put a pin on that. Where does his melancholy come in again? Why is he so sad? Do we get an answer? And his two friends, fellow merchants, it sounds, have some ideas about that. And they really wax poetic about what they think is wrong with him. That is, he's got ventures out. That is, a merchant makes his money by not by himself going and selling things, but by buying or renting the space on ships like those 6 giant galleasses in that battle image the image of the battle of Lepanto that I showed you in argosies. Oops, no, in argosies, other kinds of ships. You rent space on or buy these ships. You pack them with valuable crap, valuable to places, people in other places around the world, and you ship them off. You hope that they'll get there, sell all their stuff, using that money, buy valuable stuff from those ports, and bring them back to Venice, where then you will just make a frickin' killing on it. Making money from nothing, really. Making money from moving stuff around. That's what a merchant did. In the medieval In medieval texts, medieval European texts, merchants were kind of sleazy. They were very close to moneylenders in how you respect them because they're just kind of moving stuff. They're not making anything, right? So anyway, merchants talking to merchants, they're like, clearly it's because you have ventures out. Now, that this could be a very nerve-wracking thing you can imagine because usually, it's expensive to pack out a ship with a lot of stuff enough to make like a good haul, right? You send out most of your wealth and hope that it comes back bigger. But until it comes back, the Mediterranean was not an easy sea to navigate. The Greeks, like ancient Greek literature, is full of just fear of the sea. The entire Odyssey is nothing but sort of, if not a celebration of the terrifying cost of going out on the water. Um, so it's very, probable that somebody who throws all their money out onto the oceans, onto the sea, is going to lose everything. And this is not limited liability corporation here. There's no insurance. I mean, there might be, but there doesn't seem to be any in play in this play, right? So if you lose those ships, if those ships sink, um, you lose everything, and a debtor is liable to be thrown in jail, to be sent into the galleys. And in this play, as you see in these first two acts, famously, well, the question is whether it will happen, to like lose his life or to lose a chunk of flesh, a pound of flesh, the famous pound of flesh. Okay, back to scene one. Right, so these two guys, Cash and Moneybags, are like, oh, believe me, if I had such a venture forth, hold on. If I had such a venture forth, the better part of my affections would be with my hopes abroad. In other words, there's this idea that your mind will sort of break itself into pieces, following around your ships. He'll be peering over maps, ports, piers, and rows. Every object that makes me fear misfortune in my ventures, out of doubt, would make me sad. So they're trying to analyze him. And they actually come up blank. It turns out Antonio later says, this isn't me. I love how poetic they wax about this, though. My wind cooling my broth would blow me to an ague, a headache, when I thought that what harm a wind too great might do at sea. I could not see the sandy hourglass run, but I should think of shallows and of flats, and see my wealthy Andrew, that's the name of a boat, docked in sand, veiling her high top lower than her ribs, to kiss her burial. Look at all the passion they put into these descriptions. He's basically saying, if like a breeze goes over my bowl of soup, I'll stop eating because I'll think, oh my God, what if the wind turned and my ship got wrecked? Ah! And then he looks over and you see the hourglass, I guess, and you'd see the sand and think of like a sandbar and think, oh God, what if my ship wrecked on a sandbar? What if it wrecked so hard that it tipped over, right? Bailing high top lower than her ribs to kiss her burial, that is, to the masthead kissing the sand that wrecks it, right? So anyway, they're getting very poetic about this. Antonio says, no, believe me, no, no, I thank my fortune for it. My ventures are not in one bottom, that is one cargo hold, trusted, nor to one place. He's diversified his portfolio, I guess. He's not too worried about that. I love this, though. Why, then you're in love. It took him 100 lines to say, is it because you've got your ships out and you're scared? And then love, they're like, well, maybe, are you in love? It's like these guys don't think about love too much. It's a comedy, and they're not really worried about love. And Antonio wasn't either. Fie. He's not worried about love. He doesn't have a woman. He never gets one. Yeah? And in fact, he seems very attached to his buddy Bassanio. He seems to be his best friend ever. Everybody knows that. That's another pin, and put a pin on that for something else. Um, anyway, sorry, I just lost my place. Fi. Okay, you're right. Oh, here it is. So anyway, Solanio and Salerio, or Salarino, depending on your edition, they kind of give up here. They see Antonio's other friends coming in, and they say some things like, "Oh, we better not stick around. You're worth." Oh, Salarino says, "I would have stayed till I had made you merry, if worthier friends had not prevented me." Here comes a word that I maybe want you to keep in mind, which is just the word worth. Very old English word. Um, Funny thing about worth. The funny thing about there's actually a lot of these words come into play in this play. Worth, value, good. Just the word good. Goods and services, I can say, but I can also say my father is a good man. Isn't that weird, by the way? I think this is a play about that being weird. Um, that is to say, the overlap and the easy sort of transmission in and out of the two meanings of good and worth and value, the moral meaning and the sort of worldly meaning, um, they run afoul of each other if you kind of look at them philosophically. So at least in a Christian context, which is a big point in this play, um, yeah, the way that the value of being morally good is often directly diametrically opposed to amassing worldly goods and raising value. Um, in the terms of coin value, moral value is often inversely proportional to um, worldly value, financial value in Christian terms, which are at play in this comedy. So this idea comes into play here. There's friends that Antonio has that seem to be worth more than Salarino and Solanio, whose names again mean something like money. Yeah. So watch this word worth. In fact, I think. Well, let me come to another point in a minute, because the people that come on board now are Bassanio, who's going to go to the Portia Act 2 place, the Portia domain, and Bassanio, who's going to kind of go into the Shylock and his daughter Jessica domain. But here they come to Antonio, and they get him involved. Um, and they sort of accuse him of being too worldly and too concerned with money again. They say, you have too much respect upon the world, down at the bottom here. Um, Antonio brushes that off too. I hold the world but as the world, Gratiano. In other words, I take the world as no more and no less than it is. So, in fact, he says, I stage where every man must play a part, and mine a sad one. Oh, that's one of Shakespeare's most increasingly sort of famous and favorite metaphors, the world and the stage. We'll see it again. So Gratiano is a bit of a yuckster here too. He wants to sort of, he says, let me play the fool. We don't have a fool yet. We'll get one. But Gratiano, this guy is going to kind of serve the purpose of the windy fool, the wordy fool, to try to cheer Antonio up. And so he goes on this whole spiel here about how he knows that sometimes there's these guys, these kinds of people um, who look all somber and melancholy, and they're quiet, in order to get public opinion to think, that is, just people to think that they are profound, that they have wisdom, gravity, profound conceit, by the way, which doesn't mean conceitedness, it means cleverness, actually. Like a conceit in a poem is a clever trick, a witticism. He says, don't be like them, Antonio. Um, did I just go too far? Oh, my Antonio, I do not know of these, that therefore only are reputed wise for saying nothing. Okay, so he's saying, like, there's these people who say nothing, and therefore they get this reputation, a kind of, I don't think I'm stretching to say a credit to them from doing nothing. They amass a kind of popular public credit. Now, anyway, that's what he thinks is Antonio's doing, kind of tongue in cheek. He's trying to cheer Antonio up with this a little bit. Um, don't be like them, he says, Antonio. Um, at any rate, he heads out, um, and Antonio is left with Bassanio. Bassanio says this thing. Where is it? Gratiano speaks an infinite deal of nothing more than any man in all Venice. His reasons are as 2 grains of wheat hid in 2 bushels of chaff. You seek all day, or you find them, and when you have them, they're not worth the search. There's that word worth again. It keeps coming up. I feel like Shakespeare really works around keywords. Sometimes I feel like you can kind of find them and track them. But what is he saying here? Basically, Gratiano's a master of taking just a little bit of wealth, 2 grains of wheat, and sort of burying it in chaff to expand it and make it look bigger. He takes nothing and he makes an infinite deal of it. That is to say, he sort of creates interest. In fact, that is another kind of dominant keynote, I think, of this play, which has kind of grounds worth in a discourse that means something to the audience. Interest and money lending. What the Jew, in the form of Shylock, is so bitterly accused of doing in Christian sort of apologetics or whatever, is like, that's not the right word, but anyway, um, usury, which you'll see a word here, it comes up in the Shylock passages, simply lending money on interest, was often kind of conceived in a sort of self-congratulatory way by Christian authors and in sermons and in anti-Semitic literature, um, lending on interest was seen as a very un-Christian thing to do and very becoming of the Jews. But for reasons I said, that's a complicated thing to accuse a Jew of. Um, but at any rate, there's other applications of that basic idea that I think Shakespeare is sort of combining here, putting into conflict with one another. So we already have sort of two. Um, we have um, we have the idea of just mercantile industry, which is not creating anything, but moving things around and from nothing making something. And then you have this idea of words as somehow creating worth um, by sort of just expanding on itself ad infinitum, not really making anything, but and yet seeming more than it is. Like the silence in these melancholy men that Gratiano talks about, who seem to have more to them than they say. Taking nothing and making more, making something. It's interest, and it's sort of a consistent tone of this play. And the thing is that it's not just about the money lending. It's about love, which will come in, even though not for Antonio. It's about words, which I think is what's behind the way that Shakespeare really inflates some of the speeches in this play, like Solarios and Solanios at the beginning. Um, and it's about the merchant. It's about making money and how one makes money, and it's also about just being a good person. One thing that Antonio is, even if he's not the lover of this play, is apparently an image of a good person. So whether Shakespeare is sort of taking shots at or criticizing or sort of prizing apart what makes Antonio such a good man, what makes Shylock such a bad man within this sort of narrative perspective of this play. I think it has everything to do with ideas keyed into this question of interest, something from nothing. There's another way that comes into play when they're worrying Antonio over what's wrong with him. They say Salarino says, that's what a good place to start. He's thinking about when he sees a stone, he thinks about it, stones in the water that would scatter all the spices on the stream and robe the roaring waters with my silks, and in a word, but even now worth this, and now worth nothing. Anyway, there's word and worth coming into play. Yeah, like I said, sometimes it's as if I feel like you can kind of almost sniff out the associations that Shakespeare, the sort of just verbal associations that might be kind of ringing in Shakespeare's ears when he's putting together the structure of a play. And in this play, I think the sort of near rhyme word and worth are sort of playing. Word, worth, and world, maybe, are words that keep cropping up here and there, and they seem to sort of harmonize each other, sort of modulate in ever more complicated and curious ways, peeling out sort of an argument, as if there's like little arguments built into the sound shape of English itself. Like, why are the words word and worth so similar? But for no real semantic reason. And it's almost like though by hearing the similarity, you kind of think, oh, well, what is the worth of a word? Well, a word hasn't very much anything to do with the thing that it means. Well, kind of like worth, right? Especially if worth is like coins that have, and you know how Shylock loses his daughter, and she takes a lot of money, and he goes around Venice saying, "My daughter, my ducats, my daughter, my ducats." Ducats are a coin, right? Well, coins are kind of like words too. Like they don't necessarily, like a little circular thing with a print on it doesn't really have anything to do with what it's worth, and yet it does. And so word and worth are sort of brought into contact, I think, or maybe uh, sort of lifted out of the English language and their similarity to each other. And I think I'm going off here, and I kind of am going off on a little tangent here, but watch what Antonio says um, after Bassanio starts to admit to him that he's got a problem, that Bassanio has a problem, which is that he's dead broke, but he needs to get the Belmonte to court this girl. Anyway, here it is. Antonio says, "I pray you, good Bassanio, let me know it. That is, what is burdening you?" Notice Antonio's problem's off the table now because his best buddy Bassanio's got a problem. "I pray you, good Bassanio, let me know it. And if it stand, as you yourself still do within the eye of honor, be assured my purse, my person, my extremest means lie all unlocked to your occasions." In other words, whatever it is, as long as honor's not being totally stepped on, I'll do it. We'll see what's left of honor after he agrees to give Shylock a pound of his flesh if he doesn't pay up after 3 months. At any rate, um, my purse, my person. What a thing to say. So it's almost a rhyme in there. Is it just a throwaway? Is it just Shakespeare being flaky? I don't think so. I think the way in which a person is only worth as much as their purse, the way that a person kind of is a purse, and a purse makes the person, is very much the sort of image at the heart of this play. Notice with Portia, the girl who's being given away by her dad, depending on her suitors choosing what? A treasure chest. A treasure chest that if you open the right one, you'll find a portrait of Portia in it. Purse and person are sort of brought together in that image too. So one other way in this which this comes up, and I'm going to try to end here so I don't give you way too much to watch, is that when in scene 3, when Bassanio is trying to get some money from Shylock for his endeavor. Remember, Antonio actually does have everything he owns out on the water right now. He says that's not what's making him melancholic, but that's the case. All of his money are sent off in diverse directions. So he doesn't really have any money to give to Bassanio, but he has his credit, right? He has how he is seen in public opinion, which is something Gratiano was already bugging him about. He's worth nothing at the moment, and yet there's something there in the fact that people think he's worth something. This is, part of the sort of 16th century famously Venetian financing. At any rate, let me see if I can get to it without totally screwing over my thing here. Where are we? 55. Aha. So Bassanio goes to Shylock, and he's looking for a boatload of money. And he says, well, I will give you, as my guarantee, Antonio. And 3,000 ducats for 3 months, and Antonio bound. That is to say, Antonio will be the one who is guaranteeing this on pain of loss of his own money, right? Your answer to that, Bassanio says, Shylock says, Antonio is a good man. Bassanio says, have you heard any imputation to the contrary? Because in that sentence, it sounds like Shylock is saying he's a morally good person. He's a good man. But Shylock corrects him. He has a very different idea of what good means. Oh, no, no, no. My meaning in saying he is a good man is to have you understand me that he is sufficient. That is to say, he's financially solvent. He has credit. That's what he means by good. So here's the two senses of good coming into play for really the first time. There's a way in which this play does a lot of kind of taking a word and then putting in quotations a minute later and saying, no, 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 that's not the meaning that I was talking about in that word. What is the worth of a word? What is the meaning of the word? Are those sort of the same things? What's the value of a word in a certain instance? That becomes in play in much the same way that currency is kind of in question. What is this worth, this word? Let me see here. So this kind of comes to its ultimate expression in this play when the word of Antonio, the worth of Antonio, becomes equivalent to the body of Antonio. Literally, the person of Antonio becomes equivalent to his purse, and the purse to his person. So he's given 3,000 ducats away, and that ultimately comes down to the bond. Antonio, the bond, right? What's the bond? Well, as it becomes clear and they're back and forth, and by the way, it's clear Antonio hates Shylock. Shylock doesn't seem to have much love for Antonio either, although maybe it's a little more neutral. And Shylock puts forth a pretty convincing case that he's been treated like total shit by the Venetians for his entire life. So really, why should he love somebody like Antonio, who would just as soon spit at him as greet him on the street? Well, for all these reasons, in a sort of flight of poetic association, Shylock decides to consolidate person, and he says, let the forfeit be nominated for an equal pound of your flesh, to be cut off and taken, and what part of your body pleaseth me. Content in faith, I'll seal to such a bond, and say there is much kindness in the Jew, which is sarcastic as hell, and also brings prizes apart, as the passage right before here did, kind. Kind being equivalence, right? I'll pay you back in kind. Kind also being nature, right? Gentle nature, like humankind. And then, of course, kind being good, right? So here again, it's as if Shakespeare is taking all of the ambiguities that cut across both a sort of economic or financial and a moral domain and bringing them into something like a maximally intense contact or conflict. I think that's kind of what this play is about. Value, let's say. So it comes down to this pound of flesh. Um, yeah, I think that's all I really want to say about it at the moment. But I wanted to bring in, rather than the first topic of discussion, which is often where one goes immediately with this play, which is the question of the Jew and the representation of Jewish people in Renaissance literature. I kind of wanted to cut around that for the moment and look at Venice first. Um, Hopefully without offense to Shylock, who I think is one of the most interesting and awesome characters. By the way, one more thing before I let you go, and as you start to read this play, keep an eye on Shylock's language, because Shakespeare may be playing with something like dialect writing a little bit. There's a few places in which Shylock kind of has a distinctive way of speaking, and I don't know enough about it to really comment on it. It's just that I'm wondering if there isn't some way in which he's trying to kind of give him a Jewish accent. Um, anyway, things to think about. I'm going to let you guys go there and wish you all a good night. And as soon as I turn off this computer, it's going to be like pitch black in here. So pray for me. Bye.